Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Thursday edition here of Point of View. The next couple hours, we're going to be talking about everything from protest and pandemics, as well as Islam and even kind of a gathering storm. So just a lot of things we're going to cover. But I thought first it would be helpful to get some perspective on what is happening there on the ground, because we've seen some of these protests, and certainly that is part of an American tradition. But those protests sometimes have been co-opted by those who are rioters who want to bring a great deal of discord and property destruction, even physical harm to individuals. So we wanted to try to get some handle on what has happened so far, but especially as we look to this weekend, I'm aware of some various rallies and things of that nature that need to be addressed as well. And just as we have posted one of our articles on the myth of systemic police racism, we'll get into that a little bit later this hour, but I thought it would be good to hear from an individual that we've had on the program before, the Sheriff of Tarrant County. That's Bill Waybourn. He actually started his career back in 1978 when he joined the U.S. Air Force, became chief of police at the age of 24, held that position for more than 30 years. And so, Sheriff Waybourn, thank you once again for joining us here on Point of View.
It's certainly an honor to be with you, Kerby. I hope everything is well in your world.
It is in mine, but I want to hear about your world, because in Dallas County, there have been some protests and some riots. Tarrant County, there's been a question about curfews and things of that nature. So speak to that first issue, because some people have wondered what's going on in Tarrant County. Does it make sense to have a curfew and those kinds of questions? So how are you kind of handling the obvious legitimate protest, at the same time not letting it break into riots and anarchy?
Well, I will tell you is that I'm very, very proud of Fort Worth Police Department and their leadership. Ed Krause has done an incredible job. They've been at the point of the spear. We've been the supportive elements in several ways and helped them with several things. But we've had now 6 or 7 days of protest, and remarkably, there was only one evening that it got out of hand. And the moment it got out of hand, Fort Worth PD and DPS and Tarrant County responded to that, and I think that's the important message, is that as long as it was peaceful, everybody was supportive. The police were protecting the protesters from traffic and all that. But the moment, they started throwing stuff at police, Fort Worth made the decision to shut it down, and it was shut down. And ever since then, we've had very peaceful protests. The organizers, there's been some great organizers of those protests. And even when agitators showed up, they asked them to leave. So it's over here, it's been well.
And it seems to have gone better over there in Tarrant County than other parts of the country, even other parts of Texas. One of the questions that a lot of listeners wonder is, how much can the police protect property? We have, and I may talk more about this later after you're gone, the chief of police for Raleigh, North Carolina, and in the next hour we do broadcast in 42 different states, including North Carolina, said, I'm not going to put an officer in harm's way to protect the property inside of a building. And there is some that are saying, well, it's just property, you've got insurance. But I don't get the sense that you have that mindset there in Tarrant County. So what about the question about property damage and things that might get out of hand? How have you handled that, and how will you handle it in the future?
Well, I think what I refer to as the Giuliani theory. The first time that a brick is picked up, is that I think law enforcement needs to be prepared to take action then to extract that person from the crowd and get those agitators, get the people causing the problem. They need to go after them and arrest them. And, why life is so much more valuable than property, but at the same time, I don't think law enforcement should, just let them go and tear up things and destroy property. I think they should take action. There's been some property damage in Fort Worth, but it's been very, very limited. And I think that's because at the first sign of it, there was action taken, and it put a stop to it, and it was good.
And that you mentioned Rudy Giuliani, or even going back to the broken window theory that people have put forward, or just basic deterrence. The other day on the program, Sheriff, I talked about the fact that if you've ever been a parent, you know that if you reward bad behavior, what are you going to get? More of it, and there does seem to me a real role for police right now in terms of deterrence. If indeed a rioter recognizes that I'm going to simply turn a blind eye to property damage, or in one extreme case, I'm going to clear out the 3rd precinct there in Minneapolis and let you burn it to the ground, I don't think that encourages them to stop. I think it encourages them to actually go again. So it seems to me that sometimes, like you said, taking that first step in a preventive way provides the deterrence necessary to control those crowds that are out there.
I believe that very much so. And, I've seen the other cities where chiefs have taken the position of, we're going to let them blow off some steam, and mayors have taken that position, and they will be back tomorrow night to do the same thing, because they will be doing the looting and plundering at will at that point.
Yes. Just a little bit of a look at two issues. I'm going to talk about this more after you're gone, but there have been two issues, a pandemic and protests, and those two come together in some remarkable ways, which we will be talking about a little bit later. For example, in the autopsy of George Floyd, we found out that he tested positive for the coronavirus. We're finding all sorts of people that have been involved in these riots or even in these protests are now testing positive for the coronavirus. It does seem to me that while you're talking about these individuals who have the constitutional right to protest and be out there in the street, we still should encourage them, shouldn't we, to try to prevent the spread of this disease?
Well, absolutely, and we would love to see that. Now, yesterday I was noticing that a lot of our protesters, while they're not practicing social distance at all, but there were many of them that had masks on, and I don't know, I didn't keep up with it later on the marching, because, when you're in Texas heat at 93 degrees, walking down hot city streets, having a mask on and trying to breathe may be difficult. So I don't know if they took it off during the march, but at the initial rallying, a lot of them had masks, which I was glad to see.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation for just a few more minutes with Sheriff Bill Waybourn. And if you would like to join us, let me give you that opportunity. 1-800-351-1212. Kind of want to look ahead to the future. Talking yesterday with an individual that was trying to figure out what a march on Saturday might look like, and actually another county, that'd be Parker County, but we'll look ahead to try to get some sense of where we go from here in the future. What about the various charges being leveled against police forces and a number of other things? But if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Then we come back, we'll also spend some time after we've had this conversation to look at some of the statements that have been made during these protests. And then also, as I pointed out just a minute ago, we still have, a coronavirus out there. And sometimes those two come together, as they did in the autopsy of George Floyd, who turns out that was not only killed, but also then later tested positive for the coronavirus. And we are now starting to see many of those cases testing positive, and so I'll give you a little bit of a look at that as well. But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The Sheriff of Tarrant County with us, and if you'd like to join us and ask a question, make a comment, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Harvard professor Steven Pinker has a simple explanation for why Republicans wanted to reopen the economy. Evangelicals were exerting an influence because they believe in an afterlife, which he said is a malignant delusion. It was a bizarre tweet, even for an atheist. Although many have answered his comment, I thought we might revisit it because you are likely to run into similar arguments. Pinker argued that belief in an afterlife devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier. Actually, just the opposite is the case. Evangelical Christians believe that we are created in the image of God. He has endowed us with purpose, meaning, and dignity. Christians have historically been a source for good. They believe that what we do in society has eternal consequences. By contrast, an atheistic view devalues life. If we're merely an evolutionary byproduct, where is human dignity? If we're the accidental result of mass plus energy plus chance plus time, where is there any meaning to life? Moreover, why should we even care what another person might think, since our brain is just a meat computer with millions of neurons firing? There is no truth. There is no purpose. The Bible makes moral demands on us. Western civilization is based upon the Ten Commandments and other moral precepts. Civilized people obey these moral laws in order to have a better society. Atheism makes no demands on anyone because it rejects the idea of God and moral laws. I would argue that the denial of an afterlife is a malignant delusion. If there is no final justice, then wrongs will never be accurately judged. There is no God. There is no justice. There is no fairness. This is the sad, dark world of the atheist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we continue our conversation today with Sheriff Bill Waybourn. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Sheriff, if we can, let's talk about this issue of accountability, because that has surfaced a number of times. Can we hold officers? Most officers and most people in law enforcement are commendable individuals, but every once in a while you have somebody that crosses a line or has shown that he or she is not responsible. The individual now has been charged with a second-degree murder. They've increased that. And there were 18 different complaints against him, only 2 justified, maybe letters of reprimand in his file. One of his accomplices, I should say, was an individual that had about 6 different criticism, one that was settled, another one that's ongoing. So in some respects, can you help us understand that when maybe an individual makes a series of bad judgments and maybe is too aggressive, what's the procedure by which we can protect the American citizens from individuals that turned out to be a bad cop?
Well, I will tell you that thank you for asking the question. And first of all, I haven't studied the situation of the officer up there and what has been sustained and not sustained. It is not unusual to see an IAD folder with people with complaints on it, but the words that the American public need to look for, were they sustained and what for?
Sure.
You know, was it rude behavior or was it some type of over-aggressive or brutality? If an officer demonstrates a type of aggression that is unacceptable in policy, which occasionally happens, then that officer certainly, you need to hold him accountable and enforce far as I know here, especially in North Texas, the measure of justice is very good. That we got some great police chiefs that says, okay, we're going to retrain you, we're going to help you out here, and this is not the way to conduct it, depending on the level of it. But a second or third time, a second one, in my mind, then that officer is going to have to find another profession, and he needs to be leaving law enforcement, because if you get that opportunity to retrain and you don't get it, and then you use poor judgment again, and you're brutal to somebody, then that needs to we need to at some point find an exit of law enforcement that don't go there. And we also still need to train, like we did see in Minneapolis, this officer that was continuing for several minutes
yes.
On Mr. Floyd, is that the other officer's presence should have intervened.
Yes. There you go.
And they should have intervened so early that to get it out, because we are our brother's keeper, and we've got to account to each other. And I was disappointed to see that they did not do that. And obviously they're being held accountable criminally for that. And I'm good with that.
Well, that's the next question I was going to ask, because one of the individuals who looks like he's Asian American, and his name indicates that, he has not only had complaints, but there have been settlements with individuals. There's an ongoing case and a number of others. And so is there ever a problem where maybe there is, well, we're all part of the brotherhood, and even though I may see another officer do something that I think is inappropriate or too aggressive, since we have to work with these guys every single day, I'm not going to speak out. And so is that an issue that maybe needs to be addressed as well?
Well, there's probably is some of that. I will not say that there is not, because I think it's in every profession, whether they're doctors or even in ministry. But I think there is some of that does go on in the culture. But I think for the most part, at least the culture that I've been raised in the greater North Texas area, is that police officers here have a tendency not to tolerate those type of things, and will address them. And since I've been sheriff, I've had several officers come, not several, but we've had a few cases where those type of things have happened, and we've had the officers come forward and say, listen, this officer was too aggressive in this situation, and we reviewed that and took the appropriate action.
Yes.
But,
but again, it's something to think of. And people are just saying, okay, what are some concrete steps? We're going to have all sorts of people right now saying, well, got to kneel before these rioters. I don't think that makes any sense. Raise your hand, all that. We're going to have an ongoing debate. We've had these debates about race since the 1960s, but I'm looking for some concrete things that could change what happens in the future, because when you have people out there protesting saying, we don't want this to happen again, okay, well, right now there are a lot of signs, there's a lot of statements, a lot of words, but if we really don't want something like this to happen again, we need to talk about what can happen within law enforcement to bring about better changes, don't you think? I do.
And, I made this statement the other day that law enforcement is truly a practice, so we're constantly reforming. We're constantly looking for best practices and standards. And again, some of this relies upon the relationships in the community. I think that we have got to figure out how to get officers better included in the community. And people always go to, hey, it's training, and some of that is true. But most agencies are stretched to their limits and budgets and so forth like that, where they don't have the opportunity to train. So I think we have to look at that. We have to look at saying, okay, where are we willing to step up and pay for and make sure that they have that opportunity to train? And I think that those are some of the things that we've got to do, is engage the community constantly, be a part of the community, and also look. And sometimes everybody has a hard time. We need to look at this from different angles. And throughout my career, I've relied upon African-American and Hispanic leaders of sitting down with me and telling me what's going on from their angle of the camera. What are they seeing, and sharing that with law enforcement, of saying, hey, this is what we're seeing and this is what we're hearing. And so I think those are things that we need to be doing, and need to be doing immediately.
Just one last question. That is, we're going to have some of these protests over the weekend, and maybe in terms of any recommendations you might give, if there's an individual that's going to participate in it or just simply watch it, or even for people in the media covering it, are there some do's and don'ts? Because indeed, we've seen some things that did get out of hand, and I think if people were using a little bit of common sense and prudence, some of those things might not have taken place.
Absolutely. I would say if somebody wants to go and walk in those protests, and heck, I may want to do that myself and say, yes, we want justice. But I would say go with the thought of being peaceful in mind. Don't look at the police as the enemy. They are there to help you. We have millions and millions of contacts with citizens that go very positive every day. And then we have something like happening in Minneapolis. But it's an isolated incident right there. I would say, don't look at them as an enemy. Look at them as somebody that's going to protect you while you're doing this, and have a peaceful thought. If they see agitators, if they see somebody starting to get out of hand, my recommendation is to step away from that and not be involved in criminal activity. Exercise your rights, but don't be a part or even put up with people committing violations. And we saw that happen in Fort Worth, where the protesters ran off the agitators.
Yes. And it seems to me that that's another aspect of that. I've been in some protests. Those are a long time ago, but you sometimes see somebody next to you and say, they're not here for the same reason. And to pay attention to them or call attention to law enforcement, to somebody who may be trying to co-opt your particular rally or something like that, I think is really appropriate. So, Sheriff Bill Waybourn, we appreciate the work that you have done and appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View to talk about these issues that we read about in the news and we see on television. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kirby, and I would just request that the nation just have a pause, and let's pray about this, and let's talk as full-grown people.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into a couple of the issues that relate to this. One of those by David Harsanyi, Riots Are Violence, and a lot of that has to do, the subtitle will give you a hint, Will Burning Forests Grow Back? And that really goes back to a statement made by the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Then something we posted yesterday but never really got a chance to talk about. This is a very good piece by Heather McDonald's been on the program before, and that is the myth of systemic police racism, in which he takes the numbers from 2019, which have been recorded by the Washington Post, and then breaks it down. And if you wanted to see the visual version of this, last night Tucker Carlson used the same numbers, matter of fact, went into it even more detail, and then told you the names and showed you the pictures of some of those individuals. We'll get into that. And then I thought we would come back to this whole idea of the fact that we do have a pandemic taking place right now, and in some respects, the connection between the protests and the pandemic kind of surface when we think of George Floyd, who not only was killed, but also turned out he was tested positive for the coronavirus. And we are now starting to see evidence that many of the people that have participated in these protests are now testing positive. So we'll talk about that right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Got a number of articles, but I thought I might just mention the other day we had Michael Johnson on with the Slavic Gospel Association. And he said, I wanted to share a quick update. Through Christ Over COVID campaign, American Christians have helped Russian Christians provide over 500,000 meals to some of these desperate neighbors impacted by COVID-19, especially in rural areas really, essentially, the local evangelical church is, if nothing else, the only safety net that exists. So I thought I'd share that with you. Maybe I'll share it a little bit later for the rest of the audience, but I thought it would be something that would be of encouragement to you. And for any of you that actually participated in that, thank you so very much. Let's get to a couple of articles, first of all, that relate very much to the conversation we had with the sheriff, and then we'll get into some of those having to do with COVID-19. And this one is by David Harsanyi. It's the first article we've posted. It's entitled, "Riots Are Violence, and Will the Burning Forests Grow Back?" One of the things that I always smile about every once in a while with commentators is that sometimes these commentators assume that you know what they're talking about, because he talks about somebody who was saying it's a forest that grows back, and I'm thinking some people going, what are we talking about? So anyway, I'll give you the rest of the story that's not in the article, and that is the other day, the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in this speech, said, yes, America is burning, but that's how forests grow. Yes, America is burning. That's how forests grow. And so that's why David Harsanyi decided, you know what, I think I need to address this. And he says it's weird that this needs to be said, but here we are. And he points out that the argument always is, well, you know, if you destroy property, these businesses have insurance. First of all, I pointed out some did not. How about that African-American who was hoping on Monday to open up his sports bar and has no insurance? His life savings were burned up by the rioters. He's African-American. He's a former firefighter, and he has nothing to show for any of that. But nevertheless, the argument that David Harsanyi says is that business have insurance, or else they're peddling the false choices about life being more valuable than property. He says, have never built a business themselves. And he says, nor have I, yet I do know that having a business destroyed can be devastating, and having insurance won't make the victims whole. And the reason he brings that up is that his parents were immigrants from Hungary, and they had actually built this store. And so I'll skip a couple of paragraphs. You can read it in its entirety, in which he said, one day on a half day of school, as my luck would have it, our shop was robbed. The fact that the strip mall was situated on a busy road, or that it was the middle of the afternoon, didn't deter the thieves. 3 men, 2 inside, 1 outside, pulled out guns and demanded the combination to the safe. They cleaned out the place. Seeing a sawed-off shotgun pressed against a family member's head is not an experience I recommend. Yet in 1981, many people in the metropolitan area had either been mugged, robbed, threatened, or had their cars stolen. That year, New York City reported more robberies than in any year in its history, over 121,000 and over 2,100 murders. By the way, Sheriff Waybourn was talking about the Rudy Giuliani thing, because I remember when Rudy Giuliani took over and they used kind of that broken window theory, which I talk about in our criminal justice booklet, if you'd like to read it in more detail. But James Wilson points out that if you go into a project and there's a broken window and it's not fixed within a few days, pretty soon there are more broken windows, because it looks like nobody cares. And so there was always an argument, number one, that if there's graffiti, let's clean up the graffiti. If there's a broken window, let's fix the window. And most importantly, the first person seen throwing a brick, we don't go, well, they're just burning off some steam. No, we begin to prosecute them and provide some deterrence. But anyway, as he points out in this piece, my parents did have insurance. They were lucky enough to be reimbursed for the things that were stolen, but they would never see a penny for the years of preparation, exertion, and sacrifice. And he says, I suspect thousands of Americans who have built business, given up time with their kids, spouses, and parents, will end up in similar circumstances due to the inability of our elected officials to stop criminals and revolutionaries. And so I think it's a good point. And then he raises one other question, and I might even turn this into a commentary, although by about a week or two from now it may not necessarily be so relevant. But he asks the question, if indeed you accept this silly comment, and I could come up with a better word, but we'll just say silly, by the Attorney General of Massachusetts, that's how forests grow. He said, well, is the forest growing in Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered? Doesn't sound like it. And then reads one of the most compelling news items so far. That is, the riots and the arson that follow the protest of George Floyd's death have devastated organizations and businesses that serve communities of color. Destruction from the south side's Lake Street to West Broadway Avenue in North Minneapolis have hit immigrant and minority-owned business already struggling amidst the pandemic-induced shutdown. Now ethnically diverse neighborhoods are grappling with the loss of jobs, services, and investments. So it doesn't look to me like sometimes these forests grow so well in that situation. And just yesterday, I ran an errand which was to the east of where we broadcast, and went into an area where my wife and I used to go to restaurants, and for a while where we even used to live. And I was looking at all the restaurants that are completely shuttered. I mean, they have just not come back from the pandemic and won't. And you can take this to your own community and see exactly what's happening up there in Minneapolis. So, nevertheless, the first article there, riots are violence, and they aren't simply easily set aside as, well, that's how forests grow. The second one is a piece that I actually posted yesterday, but we never got to talk about it. And we've talked about it before with Heather McDonald, because after all, she is not only at the Manhattan Institute, but wrote a book a number of years ago called The War on Cops, and we went through this. And she takes the most updated information and looks at the fact that in 2019, police officers shot just over 1,000 people, 1,004, most of whom were armed, otherwise very dangerous. African Americans were about a quarter of those that were killed. That was 235, a ratio that has remained stable since 2015. The share of black victims is less than what the black crime rate would predict, since police shootings are a function of how often officers encounter armed and violent suspects. And then you can go into the data if you're interested, and I tend not to do that so much anymore because a lot of people say, I don't really care what the facts are. I'm convinced that there's a genocide against African Americans. I'm convinced that there is systemic racism in the police departments. And so I will give a few more numbers, but if you read it with any kind of open mind, you can see that the meme is just not true. Because she says, assuming a comparable number of victims last year, after talking about some of the homicide victims and everything, there are what she could find 9 unarmed black victims of police shootings, which first of all represent 0.1% of the African Americans killed. And last night, and she mentions 9 because one, I guess, was an accidental shooting, which makes 10. Last night, Tucker Carlson went through all 10 of those individuals. And the one woman that was shot, that's the one that our people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area would remember, because that's the one where the individual shot through the glass thinking that she had a gun. Maybe she even did. As a matter of fact, I think the conclusion was maybe she did. And now that person's been prosecuted, and they went through those 10 individuals, although only 9 really relate, because one was an accidental shooting because the individual was wrestling with the officer and the gun goes off. But nevertheless, if you go through that, you can see that that certainly is not an enormous number, and certainly not the genocide or systemic racism that people are talking about. And then she goes on to point out that a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer, and then reminds us of all the other things that have been taking place. For example, during Memorial Weekend in Chicago, you had 10 African Americans that were killed in drive-by shootings. And those are very important and need to be focused on more and more. But since they sometimes don't fit the narrative, aren't really mentioned. And then, in perhaps the best part, points out that both a Justice Department analysis and the one that I think is the most significant, an analysis by Roland Fryer, who is an African American in Harvard, who actually did the research assuming there was anti-black bias in shooting, nevertheless came to actually evidence to the contrary, because indeed when he began to really investigate it, came to the opposite conclusion of the bias he had as he went in to research it. So we have a Justice Department study. We have perhaps the most significant one by a Harvard economist, Dr. Roland Fryer, African-American, who said, I was assuming that this was evidence of bias. Actually, I found just the opposite. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and let me just mention, we're going to be getting into a different topic at the top of the hour, but just a minute ago I mentioned the research by Dr. Roland Fryer, and I thought I would pull this out. This was the commentary I wrote back in October 19th, 2017, but his name is Fryer, and it's just the way it would sound, F-R-Y-E-R. He's a professor of economics, African-American, and actually did the research a number of years ago because he was angry after the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. So he decided to collect all sorts of data, of which there is quite an abundance of this. Now, since then, of course, the Washington Post has kept track of this as well, but nevertheless collected data. And his research team, he and his research team actually examined 1,300 shootings that happened up until that time. And he was convinced, as he did the research, that he would find all sorts of evidence of racial bias. He did not. He found, he said, no evidence of racial bias when it comes to lethal force. If anything, he found that blacks were slightly less likely to be killed, which Heather McDonald has referred to as the Ferguson effect. In other words, you are more likely, if you're a perpetrator and white, to be shot if you're coming at a police officer, less likely if you're African American, because I think there's something that switches in the mind of officers thinking, if I shoot this person, even though my life is at risk, I will go through the ringer for the next couple of years and may even end up in jail. So the reality was Roland Fryer, African American who was convinced there was racial bias, found, if anything, African Americans were less likely to be killed. Now, to be fair, there also are some other issues involved in that because he did think he may have found some bias when it came to maybe non-lethal force. So I don't want to present this as just a complete slam dunk, but it was striking. And I think the quote that I put in the commentary there, which you can read in its entirety by Dr. Roland Fryer, is the conclusion that he finally had to come to was the most surprising result of my career. But again, as I've pointed out, we can go through all those numbers time and time again, but I've had a lot of people say to me with a straight face, I don't care what the data has. I'm convinced that we have systemic racism in these police forces. I'm convinced we have to defund the police department. And at that point, I can't go any further than that because I'm trying to give you the facts that are out there. Let's, if we can, though, put this in context with what has been happening previously, and that is this pandemic. As I pointed out, George Floyd, turns out, was also testing positive for the coronavirus. And one of the things Jim Garrity points at is no matter how much the country may want to physiologically and psychologically move on, there's still a pandemic taking place. The United States has roughly 1.9 million diagnosed cases. You wouldn't know that because it's not even in the news anymore. 1.1 million active cases and about 109,000 people that have died from the virus. And when you start looking at what's happening on these protests, it is not positive. The coronavirus has been present at these protests. For example, a man arrested in the protest in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, tested positive for the coronavirus. The Columbus Public Health Department in Ohio announced that someone who had been symptomatic attended protests. We have Oklahoma State University linebacker who announced on Twitter that he tested positive and attended a protest in Tulsa. You have the Minnesota Health Commissioner calling for anyone who was involved in the demonstrations over George Floyd's killing or any following cleanup efforts to be tested for COVID-19. Philadelphia, the city health department is calling for people to engage in a 14-day self-quarantine if they were at or near a protest, even if they wore a mask. Lots of luck on that happening. And I love this because they say, well, maybe we can do contact tracing. And so he has a hypothetical here. Doctor, whom have you been in contact with this past week within 6 feet or less? Patient. Well, there's my girlfriend, my roommate, a delivery guide, and a couple thousand people in the city square downtown last week. And I think this has certainly become an issue that we will talk about somewhat in the future. You ready for some good news? Well, the good news, it's not perfectly good news, but it's better, and that is we have Dr. Anthony Fauci. Remember him? Okay, he announced the other day the United States, quote, should have 100 million doses of one candidate COVID-19 vaccine by the end of the year. I think he's being careful because I think we may end up with two different vaccines simultaneously because both of them are kind of heading towards the finish line. But at the same time, here's the other part of this. When you look at the history of coronaviruses, which are something that gives us the common cold. As a matter of fact, many of us that have had the cold had a coronavirus of some sort. The report in the literature questions the durability of the immunity. There doesn't seem to be a lot of durability and protection after about 3 to 6 months. So even if we do produce 100 million doses of the vaccine, which, by the way, we have 325 million people, so it's still not as much as you'd like it to be, but even so, it might suggest the annual coronavirus vaccine just the way you get an annual flu shot. So we'll see where that plays itself out as well. And while we are spending some time talking about the coronavirus, let me point out that the Journal of Lancet, as I pointed out just the other day, actually had published a study that contradicted, this idea of the so-called anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine. And I love how the editors at the Wall Street Journal pointed this out. They said one of the tragedies of the Trump era is how opposition to the president has caused some institutions to drop their standards. You think about the FBI, the FISA warrants. but even here, Lancet doing so. And you had all sorts of people saying, Mr. President, you're engaging in quack medicine. Of course, then they tried to cite a study that came out of the VA. But even the Veterans Administration Secretary said, we only used it as a last resort when individuals were in the last hours of a veteran's life. So to say that caused their death is really inappropriate. But this one in Lancet was kind of the gold standard. It is considered the journal of record for medicine in the UK. Until about 120 scientists from around the world criticized the study's sloppiness, the aggregation of patients who were different in many respects, and then also not even dealing with the different doses of hydroxychloroquine, I should say. And so as a result, we see that it actually seemed to be quite effective, but because you had everything from the VA to Lancet saying that the president was wrong, only now are we saying, wait a minute, I think it still has demonstrated that it works. And so this is one case where a little bit of anti-Trump hatred may have also cost a few lives, because the Lancet editors a while back actually published an editorial urging all Americans to vote out President Donald Trump. So as the editor said, maybe it's fair to ask if political bias clouded their scientific judgment and caused their publication standards to slip. Well, I wish I had more time, because I have a whole section here about General Mattis and some of the back and forth on that, even some of the virtue signaling, but we're going to move on to some other topics. So maybe we'll postpone those till tomorrow anyway. And I've got a lot more to cover. So when we come back, we're going to learn as much as we can about Islam. New book out. It is part of the 40 Questions series. There's a whole series of books that have come out on 40 questions on theology and 40 questions about the end times and 40 questions about heaven and hell. This one, 40 questions about Islam. And it's been a while since we've had a chance to really educate ourselves about our Muslim friends. And certainly we just finished out the month of Ramadan, and I've seen some celebrations even in my community where many of them had happy Eid various posters. So we're going to spend some time with Matthew Bennett learning a little bit more about Islam. That's coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about Islam. It's been a while since we've done so. I might just mention that we do have a little booklet that we do make available free of charge on just kind of a general overview on Islam. And we're going to talk about a book that I think you might want to get a copy of, which, of course, that will cost you, but it is certainly well worth your financial investment. It's part of the 40 Questions series. If you're not familiar with that, there are various questions about 40 questions about angels, demons, and spiritual warfare, 40 questions about creation, evolution, 40 questions about heaven and hell, 40 questions about salvation, 40 questions about end times, and this one is 40 questions about Islam. And since we have so many of our Muslim friends, neighbors, and co-workers, it's always helpful to understand them. So there are 40 different questions in 7 parts that I think you're going to find very helpful, and it is a very well-written book in kind of a question-answer format. It is written by Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. He holds a Ph.D. in missiology from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he is an assistant professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University and joins us now by phone. So, Dr. Bennett, thank you so very much for addressing this issue, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Absolutely, Kerby. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into this, because what we need to do is understand a lot of different aspects. And the first of those is some of the history of Islam, which, of course, is tied to a man by the name of Muhammad, who was indeed in Mecca, later went to Medina, and established what today is the second largest religion in the world, one of the fastest growing religions in the world. But what do we need to know about the history of Islam, and in particular the person of Muhammad?
Yeah, and I think the history of Islam and its development is an incredibly important question in and of itself, but even maybe before that, we need to recognize that there's differing opinions as to what constitutes an actual historical account of its development.
Very true.
So
yeah.
Even as you mention Muhammad's birth and Muhammad being in Mecca and transitioning to Medina and starting this new religion, that is one account of the Islamic history and probably the prevailing one within the traditional Islamic worldview. But increasingly, there are scholars who are saying there's reason to raise some questions about how much of that detail is to be considered historically admissible data. So I'd caveat this first question simply by saying that some of our attention to the study of Islam needs to recognize that we're dealing with a traditional understanding of Islam as we articulate the received account, but it may not necessarily be as objectively straightforward as it's going to be portrayed.
And let's talk about that for just a second, because there's the first difference between, say, Christianity and Islam, because we assume, although the liberal scholars for a long time challenged, but now I think most everybody assumes that you have the various records of Jesus written during the life and times of those people who were his followers. We have multiple copies and manuscripts. You have really almost just the opposite with Islam. You have a tradition that goes on for a long period of time. You have different Qurans, if you will, and eventually you have one that's, if you will, the established one. So in some respects, you've got something very different with Islam than you do, say, with Christianity. True?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting is that for such a huge movement, such as Islam, that today can be seen as the world's second largest faith, its historical origins are rather shrouded in terms of any extra Islamic attestation to whether or not these events happened as they are portrayed. In fact, some of the earliest documentation of things that Muhammad said or where he lived or where he ministered come to us by documents that aren't any closer to Muhammad's life than a couple hundred years. And so there's some interesting questions to be asked in terms of an academic study, but I do think before I undermine the account that is held traditionally among Muslims, there's a whole lot of importance for those of us who want to have meaningful conversations with our Muslim friends to be familiar with those traditional accounts, even if there are some potentially dubious claims that are made throughout that.
Well, let's talk about the traditional history, and then maybe after the break we'll get into the sources of authority, because we all, I think, can say that if you accept the tradition that is used most often, he came from humble origins, lived in Mecca. His father died before he was born. His mother died. He was raised by a grandfather who died, an uncle, traveled in caravans. But give us a little bit of a history, just real briefly, of Muhammad, because that is, in a sense, he is obviously the central figure of Islam, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And his story is formative for the understanding of why his ministry was so important in his day and age. So as you mentioned, he came from humble origins, had a rather tragic beginning, and was born in the area of Mecca, which was known as a center of polytheistic worship. One of the things that traditional accounts recognize about Muhammad is even through his boyhood, he was recognized as somebody who was pious and yet not convinced that the polytheism around him, the pagan worship around him, was appropriate. And so he was constantly retreating to the desert to meditate and to consider the world around him and to seek what is truth and who this true God is standing behind all things. And over time, he became convinced that monotheism was the right way forward in contrast to the community around him. And so his initial ministry in Mecca is a ministry against paganism, against idolatry, and pushing towards the worship of the one true God. There's a number of formative elements throughout his youth that contribute to this, but probably the most poignant place where he found his commission was one day when he had retreated to a specific cave called the Cave of Hira in the desert. He encountered what he initially thought was a demon oppressing him, that pressed on his chest and demanded that he recite on 3 occasions. And at that point, traditional Islamic history believes that he was receiving the first commission as a messenger of Islam. Some traditions believe that in that cave he actually became privy to the whole of the Quran that would later be dispensed to him occasionally throughout his ministry. But really it was at that point that after he returned home and recounted these events to his wife, she clarified that it wasn't a demon who was oppressing him, but rather was the angel Gabriel.
Gabriel, yes. Let me take a break because I want to come back and talk about that, because that, of course, brings us to where he is in Mecca. Then he goes to an oasis later called Medina. And, of course, you talk about the Quran, and that gets us into the source, at least one of the sources of authority for Islam, along with the Sunnah. And, of course, then we learn a little bit about the theology. And just a fascinating book, and it is part of that 40 Questions series. This one's 40 Questions about Islam. And we have information about this book and about our author on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Harvard professor Steven Pinker has a simple explanation for why Republicans wanted to reopen the economy. Evangelicals were exerting an influence because they believe in an afterlife, which he said is a malignant delusion. It was a bizarre tweet, even for an atheist. Although many have answered his comment, I thought we might revisit it because you are likely to run into similar arguments. Pinker argued that belief in an afterlife devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier. Actually, just the opposite is the case. Evangelical Christians believe that we are created in the image of God. He has endowed us with purpose, meaning, and dignity. Christians have historically been a source for good. They believe that what we do in society has eternal consequences. By contrast, an atheistic view devalues life. If we're merely an evolutionary byproduct, where is human dignity? If we're the accidental result of mass plus energy plus chance plus time, where is there any meaning to life? Moreover, why should we even care what another person might think, since our brain is just a meat computer with millions of neurons firing? There is no truth. There is no purpose. The Bible makes moral demands on us. Western civilization is based upon the Ten Commandments and other moral precepts. Civilized people obey these moral laws in order to have a better society. Atheism makes no demands on anyone because it rejects the idea of God and moral laws. I would argue that the denial of an afterlife is a malignant delusion. If there is no final justice, then wrongs will never be accurately judged. There is no God. There is no justice. There is no fairness. This is the sad, dark world of the atheist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett, and he is the author of this book, 40 Questions About Islam. It is part of the 40 Questions series. And Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, go back to this a revelation supposedly from Gabriel, recite, which of course brings us to the Quran. But then as he begins, that is, Muhammad begins to preach this strict kind of monotheism in a pluralistic culture, in a polytheistic culture, there was a lot of persecution, which is eventually why he left Mecca. True?
Exactly. Yeah. So all of this actually focuses attention on what Muhammad believed himself to be doing as he took up this mantle of a prophet. And I think it's pertinent for us as Christians to consider why this part of the story ends up being somewhat confusing to our Muslim friends when we begin pointing out differences between Christianity and Islam. Because as Muhammad is living in this polytheistic environment and receiving a commission from the angel Gabriel to preach monotheism, he begins to see himself as continuing in the line of prophets who came before him, continuing in the same line as Moses, continuing in the same line as Jesus. And so, yes, he faces persecution in Mecca eventually and relocates to Medina. But when he finds himself in Medina, he begins to appeal to the Jewish communities there. And he sees himself as somebody who should be received by this community because he's one like them. And so at that point, when the Jewish community begins to respond by rejecting his mantle of prophecy, this is really one of the major fissures between Islam and the revelation that came before. It's really at that point that Islam starts to take on its own unique identity by turning away from the Jews and subsequently turning away from the Christians and recognizing Muhammad as that final seal of the prophets who has put a cap on revelation. So it's in Medina that Muhammad's followers really sort of take on their own identity and become an entity unto themselves.
Which kind of brings us then to the Quran, because if you read the Quran, and Dr. Bennett, I usually say to my Christian audience, I don't encourage it for your daily quiet time, but for those of us that have taken the time to read it, you see some very contradictory kinds of things, because the surahs, the chapters that he wrote when he was in Mecca, the Meccan surahs, are really very different than the ones that he wrote later in Medina, the Medinan surahs, because now he's no longer just a prophet like he was in Mecca. He's also kind of a warrior. And so we see in the Quran a variety of other, if you will, statements being made that are very different. And so in some respects, help us understand the importance of the Quran. As valuable as Christians value our Bibles, the Quran, I see in Muslim homes, is even more valuable. It's sometimes placed in the highest spot in the area. It is treated with tremendous reverence. Not that we don't treat our Bibles, but we tend to mark our Bibles up and turn them around and flip them and all sorts of things. So explain the importance of the Quran in Islam, because that is a significant part of the Muslim teaching, isn't it?
It is, yes. One of the chapters that I have in my book, though, kind of taps on this particular question and says, you know, the Quran is certainly something that is viewed as the source of God's revelation once and for all to humanity. It is a clear Arabic message, is what it reports for itself, of God's direction and guidance for his people. But in function, the Quran actually is so located linguistically and culturally in a 7th century Arabian context that there is little practical influence in the daily life of a Muslim that it exhibits. So it can be something that sits up high on a shelf. It can be elevated and even memorized. But when a Muslim approaches the Quran, their intent is to exhibit their own pious reverence for the book and perhaps to memorize sections of it, even memorizing the entirety of the Quran, which is one of the badges of honor within Islam. But when we as Christians, particularly evangelicals, go to Scripture, we're trying to see its message and to understand it and to ask, Lord, what would you say to me in these living words? And how does this impact my understanding of who you are and how I should live in light of that? And that second process is actually foreign to the practice of Islam, because most Muslims find themselves picking up the Quran, reading an old Arabic language that they don't use anymore, that has its own poetic nuances to it, and saying, I don't actually know what to do with this. And so it's in that point that we get to the second layer of authority, which is called the Sunnah within Islam, that gives traditional explanations of when Muhammad received this particular verse in Mecca or in Medina, these are the actions that he took, or these are the statements he made. And those things end up being of more interpretive and explanatory value of the Quran than the Quran itself can be for the average Muslim. And so what we see is that these late traditions formed 200, 300 years after Muhammad's death end up having much more influence on the daily practice of a Muslim's faith.
And again, I've had some people that said, I've read the Quran, I don't get it. I mean, it's got some stories, it looks like the Old Testament, a few things like that. And I said, well, that's because what guides the day-to-day life of most Muslims that you know is not the Quran, but it's the Hadith, it's the Sunnah, it is those things. Or even in countries that are dominated by Muslim thought, it's the Sharia law, which I guess we should get into as well, because those traditions actually govern your day-to-day actions, govern how certain cases are going to be adjudicated within a court. And so in some respects, understanding those may be even more important than understanding the Quran.
Certainly, if you're looking to understand your Muslim neighbor or to ask the question, well, why do they pray in that fashion and that number of times per day? Actually, if you were to look at the 5 pillars of Islamic practice, each one of them would have maybe its roots in the Quran, but the actual specifics are detailed in the hadith or the Sunnah literature. So, for example, if you were to look through the Quran and see where are the 5 daily prayers that are mandated within Islam, you could get 3, maybe 4 listed in different places that you could compile, but it's not until you appeal to the hadith to hear a story about Muhammad going before God himself and having to barter with him down from 50 prayers a day down to 5 that you get that number. And so even the core elements of Islamic practice, these 5 pillars, require this later material to give shape and detail to the practice of Islam.
And again, you mentioned the 5 pillars of Islam, but since I'm coming to a break, I want to give you a break to kind of focus on that, but we'll come back and talk about this idea of the 5 pillars of Islam and then even some of the 6 articles of faith, and then we'll talk about some of the differences between Shiite and Sunni. But let me just real quickly, as we're going to a break, mention that this is a book that you should be able to easily find in your bookstore. But if you cannot, we have a link so that you can get it in paperback. It's published by our friends at Kriegel. And there are 40 different questions with answers in 7 sections. We won't cover all of it. No way we could possibly do so. But let me alert a few of you, and that is the fact that each one of these questions has a very good detail with a number of footnotes, and then at the end of each one of the chapters, there are usually about 5 reflection questions. So if you've been thinking, we'd really like to be able to educate our listeners about Islam. We have Muslim friends, neighbors, co-workers, maybe even sometimes family members, and we really want some people that are in our church, in our small groups, to understand a little bit more about reaching out to the Muslims around them. This would be a perfect series. You could do, of course, 1 chapter a week, and that would take you most of the year. Or you could do 1 section a week, and that would be 7. That would certainly be enough as well. So, again, 40 different questions, 7 different parts and categories with reflection questions at the end. It's just perfect for not only individual study, but for those of you that are small group teachers or Bible fellowship leaders. Let me just encourage you to get a copy of the book. And if you find yourself saying, I went to find it in my local bookstore, but I couldn't find it, we have a link to it right here on our website. And so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. 40 Questions About Islam. The guest that we have today, Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. And when we come back, we'll look at a little bit more on those 5 pillars of Islam and some of the differences between various Muslims around the world. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about this book, 40 Questions About Islam by Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, no doubt you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It came out this year, but nevertheless, if you have any difficulty at all, we have an opportunity for you to order it either in paperback or Kindle. And Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, continue on. The Theology of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam. So let's first of all talk about the things that almost all Muslims would agree in, and then we'll talk about some of the major divisions in Islam. But what about the 5 pillars of Islam that you alluded to in the last segment?
Yeah, so if you open up any sort of an introductory book about Islam, this is going to be something that features in its introduction section, trying to identify what are the commonalities between Muslims across the globe. And probably some of the easiest things to see are these 5 pillars. There are 5 actions that make a person a good Muslim. The first one is making the Islamic confession, which is called the Shahada, which is basically the confession there is no God but the God, or Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger, or the prophet of God. So that confession is something that Muslims hear every day. When I lived in North Africa and the Middle East, we heard it 5 times a day as part of the call to prayer. It's a confession that binds the community in unity, and it's also the way that if you were to be an adult convert to Islam, you would join the community, would be by making this confession that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. That confession leads to a number of different actions in light of believing that there is one God who has a way of living. The first is the 5 daily prayers that I mentioned. One thing that's important for Christians to note when we say prayers, there are 2 different words for prayer within Islam. There's dua, which is what we typically think of when we think of an extemporaneous prayer, where we're petitioning God with our needs or worshiping him out of the abundance of our joy. But this particular prayer is much more of a ritualized and memorized, embodied practice, where you go into the mosque ideally and pray shoulder to shoulder facing Mecca with the community of Muslims, following some ritualized motions and reciting a memorized prayer. So in many ways, this is an interruption to a person's day, 5 times each day, 7 days a week, in which they are forced to remember that there is a God who stands above them and who orders their life. So those 5 daily prayers are the second pillar. Once a year, they interrupt their lives for a period of 30 days where they fast. This is called Saum, or Ramadan fasting. We actually just completed the month of Ramadan in the last several weeks here. And during this time, Muslims refrain from eating or drinking or having sex within marriage during the daytime hours for these 30 days. This is a time for the community to, again, interrupt the normal life of the calendar year in order to remind themselves that they are ultimately under God's authority. The fourth of the pillars is almsgiving or charity. It's called zakat. They're supposed to give 2.5% of their income to charity, either through the mosque or directly to the poor. And then the final thing is that once in their lifetime, they are to attempt a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is known as the Hajj. And this pilgrimage takes them back to the place where Muhammad was traditionally thought to have been born, and also the place that after his people established themselves as an independent and strong community of faith, it's the place that they marched victoriously on, and Muhammad overtook Mecca. At the center of this particular pilgrimage is the fancy word for it is circumambulation, but the idea that they are to walk around this central temple known as the Kaaba, which during Muhammad's day served as the center of polytheism, but which after he liberated the city from its polytheism was dedicated to the one true God. So these are the 5 pillars that make up common Islamic practice and form the basis of what's expected of a good Muslim.
And again, you go into some of the other theological ideas in the articles of faith, but I thought for just a minute, since we're talking about the similarities, anybody that has been watching the news over these last few decades knows that there are very different views about the Quran, about how this should be worshipped. And the differences are between the Sunnis, which are primarily the majority, and those are the kind of Muslims you'd find, for example, in Turkey or Egypt or other places, and the Shia, those found primarily in the southern part of Iraq and in Iran. But that is very different. And again, back to the history, that goes back fairly early in terms of the split, in terms of who can be a caliph, who can be an imam, who can be the leader of Islam. So explain that, because that division is something we talk about so often here on Point of View.
Yeah, that division is something that has probably in recent days become more pronounced, as there are not only religious expressions involved, but also various political interests within those nations that you just listed that seem to be set up antithetically to one another, such that I think those distinctions have become convenient at times for politicians in that region to set themselves against the other nations represented by the opposing branch. Interestingly, my wife and I have befriended an Iraqi couple in Ohio here, and one of our first conversations, knowing that Iraq is a place of the presence of both Shia and Sunni, we asked them, which branch of Islam they come from, and they kind of chuckled, and they said, really, since the 1990s is the first that we have really thought about that in Iraq. They said, we got married, and on our wedding night, I found out that she was Sunni and I'm Shia. It didn't make any difference to us up till that point. So there's been some perhaps overstating of those differences as it has been politically convenient in recent times. But the traditional understanding of where those differences comes from is exactly what you alluded to, the proper understanding of who was supposed to lead the community of Muslims after Muhammad died. There's a traditional account that sees the first split between Shia and Sunni over this issue of the immediate successor upon Muhammad's death. The Shia believe that it should be somebody from within Muhammad's family, and his cousin Ali should have been the de facto leader, whereas the majority vote within the community went to Abu Bakr, who was one of Muhammad's nearest associates. Over time, what you see is that Ali ends up being the fourth ruler over the entire community anyway, but the Shia have already established that they don't follow the leadership of the intervening caliphs. And so at that point of following the right succession of leadership is really one of the places that you begin to see this divide. They believe in the same Quran. They practice largely the same pillars, adhere to the same articles of faith, with some slight differences. And then their secondary body of literature, the Shia have some teachings that have authoritative binding on their community in a way that would not be recognized among the Sunni. So those are the major differences.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into maybe just a little bit about how we can maybe share the gospel with our Muslim friends. But again, we've only skipped around a little bit. We've talked briefly about some of the traditional history of Islam, the sources of authority for Islam, even some of the theology of Islam. Haven't really gotten into much on the practice of Islam, but some fascinating chapters there, and the whole issue of the Quran and the Bible, and even some of the scholarship. But I thought this last section here on the Christian gospel and followers of Islam, how can we use some of the things that Muslims say? How can we share love and even the gospel with Muslims, how we can even develop a love for our Muslim friends? And so we're going to spend some time in the last segment talking about this. But if you find yourself saying, this really would be something I'd like to study, or perhaps for those of you that are small group leaders or Bible fellowship leaders, this would be something we could teach in our Sunday school class, this is just a great resource. 40 different questions in 7 different categories. As I said before, you could do one a week and take you almost a year, or you could take each one of the sections and have people read multiple chapters each week, and that would still take you 7 weeks. And there's some great questions already built in. Be very easy to teach. Let's take a break. We'll talk more about some of these 40 questions about Islam right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
40 questions about Islam. Dr. Matthew Bennett with us. And just for a few more minutes, Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, talk about witnessing to our Muslim friends. And there are a couple of things that I'm sure you would want to mention. One is sometimes we as Christians have some misconceptions about Muslims. But my experience has been that Muslims have a lot of misconceptions about what Christianity is or is not, about some of the basic doctrines of Christianity. So as we share the gospel, sometimes we have to be willing to explain or maybe clarify some of the misconceptions that they might have. But as an individual that has lived in Africa and has been involved in this in the Middle East, has been teaching on this for years, can you give us some ideas about how we could approach our Muslim neighbors and things to say, maybe things not to say, some kind of do's and don'ts? What could you share with us?
Yeah, I think this is honestly the reason that I wrote this whole book. So you mentioned it's 7 parts long. The first 6 parts really build a foundation to get to this 7th part, because I found that, honestly, our Muslim friends and neighbors are yes, maybe misinformed or have misconceptions about Christianity, but they're also curious and they want to engage in conversation. And I think so often, particularly for those of us living in the United States, our understanding of Islam comes from whichever news source we tend to go to for news. So on one hand, we may see Muslims as those who are antithetically opposed to everything we stand for and are, just going to become terrorists at any moment. And on the other hand, we may see Muslims as just worshiping the same sort of God as we do, and so we should all just get along. But I want us to pave that middle road of saying our Muslim friends and neighbors are bearing the image of God as human beings, and as long as they are sucking breath, they have the opportunity to be prompted by the Spirit to respond to the gospel message. And so they need that message. So what is our responsibility as Christians? It is to be there to explain and to help them understand the message of Scripture. And I think one of the things that we find is that our posture, once it changes to being open to sharing with our Muslim friends and engaging that curiosity, is the first thing that needs to shift. But then when we begin explaining the gospel, there's many times that we can leave frustrated. And I found this in my own experience, saying, I know that I just spoke the gospel, but I could tell that it didn't actually get communicated. Where is that missing link between what is being said and what is being received? And I think that's the reason I find it so important that we educate ourselves about Islam, because for us to explain the Christian gospel requires us to use words that for our Muslim friends already come preloaded with Islamic meaning, not biblical meaning. And so when we say things like, Christ died according to the Scriptures for our sins, we begin to use categories like Christ, which shows up in the Quran, but in a different fashion. We talk about sins, which shows up in the Quran, but in a different fashion. And we talk about Christ's atoning death, which the Quran categorically rejects. And so even in that simple statement, what is communicated is being received in the categories and by the definitions that come preloaded with Islamic baggage. So our task of actually explaining the gospel to our Muslim friends should begin much further back. I joke with some of my students saying, how many of you have ever explained the gospel using the book of Leviticus? And I have actually had one student raise his hand and say, yes, I have. But most of them kind of laugh it off until I say, is it possible to explain Christ's death and resurrection, his ascension and session as our great high priest without referring to Leviticus? And then I use that to show that our Muslim friends don't have the categories of sacrifice and atonement that come from Leviticus so as to make sense of a God-man who would die in our place, who would shed his blood and present it before the right hand of God. And so a task in sharing the gospel with our Muslim friends should begin by asking them questions and not assuming that just because we share language like sin and Christ and atonement, that communicates the same thing. Rather, we need to ask questions and listen to their response, and then invite them to read Scripture for themselves, because that's really going to be the place where the Spirit softens their heart and shows them that there's distinct categories and distinct ways that these important words function within the Bible that are at odds with the way that those concepts land in the Quran.
And I loved your point about asking questions. First of all, didn't Jesus ask a lot of questions in the New Testament? But even more so, if you ask questions, it's been my experience, which is certainly more limited than yours, but nevertheless, sometimes you talk to Muslims and you realize, I may know as much about the Quran as they do. I may know as much about what Muslims typically believe than they do, because it may get into a situation where they maybe are kind of secularized in terms of the Muslim faith. I grew up in a Muslim country. I've come to this country, and I really don't even know that much about it. It's just part of my heritage, but I really don't study it. I don't go to the mosque. I don't even necessarily know. Or they may have some misconceptions about Jesus and what it means for him to be a Messiah, like you said, sin, or a variety of other things. So that is certainly the case. But since we're just about out of time, one of the things that I've said, and I want to hear your comments, is that I think this would be certainly a great book for individual study. But I know, Dr. Bennett, that we have a lot of listeners who are pastors, Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and others. And the way you've put together these 40 questions in 7 categories with discussion questions at the end, I think this could really be taught in a small group Bible study or something of that nature. What do you think could actually be used?
Absolutely, and that's been my heartbeat. I mean, on one hand, I've recognized this is an academic book in some ways within Kriegel's line, and so it does have that potential to be used in a classroom. But my purpose in writing it was to put it in the hands of people who are leading others, whether those are pastors or small group leaders, who are seeing Muslims in their neighborhood and not knowing how to respond, but wanting to do so. And so I absolutely would commend it for that sort of a group study or individual study for the purpose of beginning to help yourself not know everything there is about Islam, but rather be able to ask informed questions of the Muslim people who are inhabiting the place the Lord has placed you.
And I might just mention that Bruce Riley Ashford, who's been on the program with us many times, said 40 Questions About Islam is the best one-stop introduction to Islam written by an evangelical Christian. In it, Matthew Bennett provides concise and reliable answers to the most important questions people have about Islam and Muslims, encouraging Christians all the while to relate lovingly, respectfully, and evangelically to their Muslim neighbors. Recommended highly without reservation. So, if nothing else, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to focus some time and attention on this book. And Dr. Matthew Bennett, I appreciate you writing the book, and I appreciate you giving us an entire hour today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's my pleasure. Thank you for it.
Well, let's, if we can, take a break. Let me just mention again, one of the things we have made available in the past is this little booklet on Islam that I've put together, and it recommends some other books, and maybe when we revise it, I might even add this book to the list of books that we would recommend, because we are convinced that you need to know more about Islam, and certainly know more about your Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. So, again, that's one of the reasons we have focused our time and attention on this particular book. If you go to the website right now, which is pointofview.net, click on the picture of the book. It gives you an opportunity to order it if you would like to do so, either in paperback or Kindle. You might want to get multiple copies for a small group study, and so we have it available to you right there on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing, I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Albert Mohler. We were quoting him recently. We, of course, every Friday just about have Kelly Shackelford in studio with us, and one of the things that the two of them wrote was a piece on this issue of religious liberty, and so we've always enjoyed talking with him. Matter of fact, last time we talked about the Apostles' Creed, discovering authentic Christianity in the age of counterfeits. This new book, The Gathering Storm, Secularism, Culture, and the Church. And as I was growing up, a number of books that were actually in my bedroom, that were actually my father's, were books by Winston Churchill, and one of those was the title, The Gathering Storm. So both the title was very provocative, and then as I opened the book to look at the gathering storm over Western civilization, the church, human life, marriage, the family, gender, even generational issues, culture, and, of course, religious liberty, I knew it was a conversation we would certainly want to have. So let's, if we can, welcome back to the program the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky, Dr. Albert Mohler. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's always good to be with you and the audience at Point of View Radio, and I always know it's going to be a great conversation, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I am too. How about Winston Churchill? It turns out that you said since I was in the 8th grade, Winston Churchill has been a figure of fascination and inspiration. And you always have to think twice about titling a book on the basis of one of the 6-volume history of the war, but I thought it was very apropos. But give us some background, if you might.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. By the way, the background for me is when I was in the 8th grade and was told I had to write a paper on a great person from history, and had to get the teacher's permission. And I don't know why I came up with Winston Churchill, but as a 13-year-old, I said I want to write on Winston Churchill, and I've been fascinated with him ever since. And Elton Trueblood, the Quaker theologian, used to say that every young man needs a perpetual vision of greatness. You know, so people to whom he can look and say, I'm going to learn from that man. And of course, you can say man or woman the rest of my life. And so if you come into my library, I'm speaking to you now from my personal library, you'll see oil paintings on the wall of Martin Luther and so many other figures from the history of the church. But you're going to see 2 oil portraits of Winston Churchill and about 700 books by and about him, because I've been fascinated by him. And look, you talk about a life lived on the canvas of history. Here's the man who in the 1930s, when he was already written off by the British political class, who saw what others would not see, and that was the rising threat of Nazi Germany. And so after the war, after he basically became the great leader of saving Western civilization, it was Winston Churchill who wrote that 6-volume history of the Second World War. The first volume, as you mentioned, The Gathering Storm. Mm-hmm. He saw the storm gathering. All the beautiful, intellectual, powerful people in Britain and in Europe at the time denied it, but he didn't, and that's why he had the credibility to lead Britain through the Second World War. So I wrote this, Kerby, and borrowed the title partly to tell that story and to say there are gathering clouds of a coming storm we need to see in 2020.
Before we get into those chapters, I thought I'd mention one other particular book that you mentioned just in passing, but it's one we've discussed here even last week, and that is the book by historian Tom Holland, who, by the way, is an atheist, but nevertheless wrote the book Dominion, The Making of the Modern Mind, and really, in a sense, changed his mind. It went from saying, well, I'm not sure how important Christianity is, to saying, really, you don't have Western civilization unless you have Christianity, that certainly we have Rome, and I've oftentimes said Rome plus Christianity gives you Western civilization. Now that we want to jettison Christianity, we go back to Rome, and in some respects that's kind of a setup for your chapters, because we do see a gathering storm when you no longer have kind of a Christian superstructure over this, if you will, Western foundation. It gets to be pretty difficult, doesn't it?
Oh, it's a tremendous threat. It threatens whether or not we can have what we know as Western civilization and perpetuate it. Kerby, I think you're basically just exactly right. You take classical civilization, Greece and Rome, and add Christianity to it, and you end up with European civilization. Western civilization, you end up with ordered liberty, constitutional self-government. You end up with a unique and uniquely Christian understanding of human dignity. There's a reason why human dignity was affirmed in a way never before or since in the history of humanity by the civilization that Christianity produced. Because we know that every single human being is not just a citizen, but is a human being made by the Creator in His image, and thus possessing full dignity. And so you can't have, that's the big problem. I mentioned Elton Trueblood before. I wrote my first thesis on him, and he had lots of quotable quotes. But one of them is when he talked about Western civilization, he said, even in the midpoint of the 20th century, he said that our civilization has become a cut flower civilization.
Yes, cut flower, yeah.
And, cut flowers are beautiful on a table, but they're going to die. And he said, cut off from the root of Christianity, Western civilization cannot continue to bloom. And I think that's the great danger we face today.
In your chapter on Western civilization, you not only talk about the fact that we have a secular society, but secularization. Peter Berger's talked about that. Os Guinness has been on the program talking about that. But that's the process by which all the major institutions have become secular. True?
True. And it's almost done. I mean, it's a project almost complete. And in Europe, so complete that the European Union won't even admit that Europe had a Christian past. In the United States, not quite as baked a cake, but still, we're in a very different situation. I define secularization as the process by which the binding authority of theism disappears, which is the binding authority of God. And it's not in America that most people say they don't believe in God. It's just that whatever they say they believe in God doesn't matter.
Let's see if we can take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Dr. Albert Mohler about the gathering storm, and back to that, of course, famous quote from Elton Trueblood about the fact that America and really Western civilization has become, if you will, a cut flower civilization. As you said, those flowers look good on the table, but they are eventually going to die because they don't have those roots. So we've focused a little bit of time on Western civilization, but we're going to come back and get in more detail. First of all, what about the church? You might say, well, if the church was strong in the midst of that, that wouldn't be a problem, but of course it is. Then what about the gathering storm of human life and what it means to define life, marriage and family and gender? Those are issues we talk about so often here on Point of View. And then a gathering generational storm, which we do talk about sometimes when we talk about the millennial generation, Generation Z, and those kinds of things. And then just the whole issue of the engines of culture, and then finishing off with, as we'll talk about, the gathering storm on religious liberty, which again is one of those very important op-ed pieces that were written by Dr. Al Mohler and Kelly Shackelford, who with Penn and Dexter joins us almost every Friday. So we'll get into those issues, and if you find yourself saying, okay, this is a book I'd like to read, it is out, and it is published by Thomas Nelson, and we will give you information about how to get a copy of that on our website, pointofview.net, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Harvard professor Steven Pinker has a simple explanation for why Republicans wanted to reopen the economy. Evangelicals were exerting an influence because they believe in an afterlife, which he said is a malignant delusion. It was a bizarre tweet, even for an atheist. Although many have answered his comment, I thought we might revisit it because you are likely to run into similar arguments. Pinker argued that belief in an afterlife devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier. Actually, just the opposite is the case. Evangelical Christians believe that we are created in the image of God. He has endowed us with purpose, meaning, and dignity. Christians have historically been a source for good. They believe that what we do in society has eternal consequences. By contrast, an atheistic view devalues life. If we're merely an evolutionary byproduct, where is human dignity? If we're the accidental result of mass plus energy plus chance plus time, where is there any meaning to life? Moreover, why should we even care what another person might think, since our brain is just a meat computer with millions of neurons firing? There is no truth. There is no purpose. The Bible makes moral demands on us. Western civilization is based upon the Ten Commandments and other moral precepts. Civilized people obey these moral laws in order to have a better society. Atheism makes no demands on anyone because it rejects the idea of God and moral laws. I would argue that the denial of an afterlife is a malignant delusion. If there is no final justice, then wrongs will never be accurately judged. There is no God. There is no justice. There is no fairness. This is the sad, dark world of the atheist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Dr. Albert Mohler as we talk about his new book, The Gathering Storm, Secularism, Culture, and the Church. And one of those issues is, of course, the gathering storm in Western civilization, but the gathering storm in the church. Dr. Mohler, some people might say, well, if the church is strong, we can maybe resist the tide. But as you point out, theological liberalism has been making its way into all sorts of denominations anyway. And so you have kind of a passive secularism, but then you have even an active secularization, because in addition to that, another weapon that oftentimes is used against the church, and that also relates to another chapter later on, is if your church is seen as anti-LGBTQ, well, that's enough to set you aside as well. So for a number of different reasons, the church, that is the rock upon which Jesus built his church, is really dealing with some really significant forces, which in many cases are undermining its ability to speak truthfully to the culture.
You know, I can remember a song, Kerby, when I was a young person, a big church anthem called "Let the Church Be the Church." And you know, I think the church's distinctive role is going to become much more clear in a society that's secularizing, because a secularizing society means that cultural Christianity is disappearing. People no longer come to church because they gain social capital by hanging around with us. So we're about to find out where the believers are. And
Yes.
One of the church's main responsibilities, as well as calling people to Christ and sharing the gospel, is going to be preparing Christians and arming Christian parents and families and individuals to resist the secularization of the mind and heart and soul that is the demand of our society right now. And the LGBTQ issues are right at the intersection. I appreciate you raising that, because the secular society is now saying, okay, and by the way, you can't have the normalization and legalization of something like same-sex marriage unless Christianity's moral influence is in radical retreat. But now it's not only in retreat, we're being told if you don't get with the program, then you don't deserve a place in civilized society. So we're in a battle. There's just no doubt about it. I don't mean to make everything sound belligerent and warfare, but, frankly, we're being told you can't do this, you can't go there, you can't say that, and Christian faithfulness is on the line.
I would think so. Again, I'm going to keep this moving because there's so many great chapters, but one of those, the gathering storm over human life. And a good way to illustrate how bad this has become is there used to be individuals that would say, abortion's not a good thing, so let's make it safe, legal, and rare. But now even rare is not mentioned. And the example that you use is somebody we've interviewed on this program before, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse, who simply was trying to say, look, if a child is born accidentally from a botched abortion, certainly we could all agree that at that point, that individual that survived that botched attempt should be given some kind of health care. And he couldn't even find enough senators in the United States Senate. This is not difficult, heavy lifting, but it illustrates how far we've come and how now, if you want to talk about people that are extreme on abortion, that's definitely the people on the left, isn't it?
Yes, for the left, it's the new sacrament. I mean, in a secular society, abortion's become the sacrament that they're going to protect over all. And, we've seen state after state liberalize their abortion laws to make abortion legal right up until the moment of birth. And then you mentioned Senator Sasse, that Baby Born Alive Protection Act that didn't get passed in the United States Senate. And it's because the abortion logic is working its way through. Just very quickly, one of the points that Winston Churchill made in The Gathering Storm is that the logic of arguments works its way out. If you read Mein Kampf, well, you should be able to to prevent Auschwitz, because if this set of ideas comes to shake the government, then we're doomed. And so I just want to argue on the sanctity of human life. We are doomed as a society if we continue to embrace what the culture of death now demands.
Let's, if we can, maybe focus on some of the middle chapters, because you have a gathering storm over marriage, over family, and of course that gets into gender and sexuality. And we sort of already tipped our hand on it, but this, I think, is kind of intriguing because you would have, up until maybe the Lawrence decision or Obergefell decision or something like that, have usually get a pretty standard response, maybe even a very significant majority belief that marriage is between one man and one woman. And if indeed somebody wants to pursue something else, that's fine, but we certainly don't need to codify it into law. And that we know what marriage is, we know what families are, and all those definitions are up for grabs today, aren't they?
Well, it's really interesting that the people who said we don't need to define it are now the people who say we need to define it differently. You're looking at the moral world here turned upside down. If you can say that a man and a man can marry, and a woman can marry, and of course the permutations will continue from there, and you look at the entire set of letters, LGBTQ, and you recognize that you've got to turn reason on its head to get here. You've got to turn creation order upside down. But this is a society just absolutely determined to do that.
And so one of the things I think we need to do, and maybe we need to talk about the positive message for just a minute, which you do as well, is why is there marriage? What is the value of marriage? And in some respects, for especially our pastors listening right now, Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship leaders, we need to once again emphasize what marriage is and to present that in a positive way. How would you do that?
Oh, first of all, by living it out. I think there's something so morally powerful about rightly ordered marriage. And, it's really interesting, Kerby, by the way, that so many of the progressives or liberals in our society who've been trying to argue against any normative definition of marriage, they've been arguing for divorce, legitimization of sex out of wedlock, and, you just go down the list. They still tend to get married and live pretty conventional lives. It just shows you the goodness of marriage. If you want to raise children, guess what? There's one social context that leads to the healthy raising of children, and that's marriage. And children need a mother and a father. It's still a picture. I was going through a box the other day, and I found an elementary school book that my grandmother had taught decades and decades ago, and the pictures of the family there. And I thought, here's the thing. The progressives in our society say those pictures are outdated, but most of them still live in that picture. It's the rest of society they're going to turn over into mayhem and relativize. And so I think we got to teach the truth about marriage. And by the way, that means starting with creation. I mean, here's one of the glorious truths of the Christian faith.
Yes.
The story about marriage begins in a garden. It begins with Adam and Eve, the goodness of marriage. And just to point to God's perfect plan in creation, evangelical Christians often don't know how to start there. But that's where the glory of marriage begins, is right there in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2.
And it does seem to me that that's kind of the point that we start with, and then talk about the importance of companionship, of how that is an image of the church and the image of Jesus Christ, and those kinds of things. And it still seems to me that we're missing the opportunity to address that, in part because once you start talking about marriage and you talk about how marriage is for life, you start thinking, well, there are people in the congregation that have been divorced, so maybe I don't talk about that. Or maybe we talk about the importance of being married before you get involved sexually. But, well, I don't want to talk about that because I know there's a number of people in the congregation that are living together, cohabiting. And so in some respects, we've kind of blunted the biblical message that needs to be proclaimed from the pulpits of America.
Absolutely, Kerby. What an excellent point. And, one of the things pastors and church leaders need to keep in mind is that there's no reason to preach unless you're going to preach the truth. There's no reason to come to church unless you're going to be confronted with the truth. And Christ's people can handle the truth. And the fact is, every one of us is a sinner. And it's God's grace that our sin be named and identified, and that God's plan be held up, even as we will fall short of it. Every single one of us is going to fall short of God's plan in some respect. That's what we call sin. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But it is an insult not only to the church members, it's an insult to God to say, we're not going to talk about your perfect plan for humanity because it might hurt someone's feelings. That is one of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard in Christian ministry. But you are right. There are so many preachers who are afraid to say what they know to be true because it might offend someone. Well, in the short term, it might. But I think those same people would say to their own children, divorce is not a good thing. And by the way, the children will tell us. And by the way, sex outside of marriage is just never a good thing. So we've got to dare to say it out loud.
We'll continue our conversation on The Gathering Storm with Dr. Albert Mohler right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Albert Mohler. The book is entitled The Gathering Storm. It is published by Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we do have a link so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Secularism, Culture, and the Church. But as you go to our website, you'll also find that we have a link to albertmohler.com. You don't even necessarily have to know how to spell his name because we've got it all right there, and you can find out more about the briefing, a variety of other things, and of course there's information about this book. So we will talk a little bit later about what you can find on that website. But Dr. Mohler, since we're talking about marriage, let's move to family, a gathering storm over family. And here's another good illustration of sometimes where there's a hesitation, where pastors maybe don't talk about the importance of fathers. And yet, if you look at the turmoil in our society today, fathers are important, and two parents are important, and all sorts of issues that really need to be addressed from the pulpits aren't. And this isn't now just the conclusion of a few Christians, but one of the things that has been so striking is to see individuals who are kind of secular sociologists that are seeing how much more valuable the biblical ideas about sex and marriage are, and they're saying the same kinds of things that the Bible's been saying for millennia.
No, you're right. It's right there. And by the way, we have a good theological category for that, which is common grace.
Yes.
That by God's common grace, a knowledge of the rightness of marriage is built into us in our conscience to the degree that every single civilization has found its way to recognizing the covenant union in one way or another of a man and a woman, and the responsibility of being parents. And you talk about the family, the silence of so many pulpits on the biblical understanding of the family is just devastating. And it is fear of the world, there's no doubt, and fear of offending people. But if you've got well, just look at the fact that every single historian I know, but in particular, people like Pittarim Sorokin and others who've looked at the history of civilization say that, and by the way, Sorokin was he was a conservative. He was a founder of the sociology department at Harvard, and he fled the Soviet Union and came, and he said the first obligation of any society that's successful is to reproduce itself, and the second is to raise boys to be men who are a part of the society and fulfill their responsibility. And, that's like a giant trumpet blast, isn't it? That the second most important responsibility of a society is to raise boys to be men. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a Democratic senator for many years. And I was just reading one of his works the other night when he said that the crisis in America, he was saying in the 60s, he said the crisis in America is that there are too many boys who do not have the one thing necessary for a boy to grow into successful manhood in just statistical terms, and that's a father or a strong male figure. Now, there are all kinds of single moms out there raising boys, and God bless them. They're raising daughters and sons, and they're doing courageous, wonderful work. God bless them. But they would be probably the first to say, I wish there was a strong male influence in the life of my son. And so we need to be unashamed to say, this is God's plan. This was God's plan from the beginning. Sometimes that plan is wounded by a car accident or a death. Sometimes it's wounded by human behavior. In any sense, you don't redefine marriage because of the wounds. Instead, you point to the ideal and encourage people to live it out to the greatest degree possible.
Very good. Let's get into another chapter, and that is the gathering storm over gender and sexuality. I was thinking that if you and I had this conversation a few decades ago, this chapter wouldn't even be in there, because we at least could make the assumption that we understand what boys and girls are, that they are different, that they should be in separate athletic events and not compete against each other. We wouldn't think that the issue of transgenderism would be any kind of issue, but here we find ourselves with actually one of the larger chapters in your book.
Yes, Kerby, because it's perhaps the most remarkable and radical thing we could encounter. The T in LGBTQ upends not only the entire civilizational order, it upends the entire creation order. I mean, you can't have even a conversation in English language if boy and girl, man and woman, husband and wife, brother, sister don't mean anything, or if you're told you can't use those words anymore. But that's what we're looking at. And you said decades ago. The only challenge I would say is even 1 decade ago.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Even a decade ago it was called the gay rights movement. Well, you can't say that anymore. And by the way, Andrew Sullivan, you'll know that name, very prominent.
Yes.
Homosexual male intellectual. He said, look, there's no point being gay if you don't know what a man is. And the same thing's being said by feminists, by the way, who say, you can't have a women's college if you don't know what a woman is. And you even have athletes like, Martina Navratilova saying, look, you can't have women's sports if biological males are competing. And that's real life these days. It's an insanity that the powers that be are telling us we have to accept. Civilization won't work. It simply won't work, and it's going to bring devastation into individual lives.
Well, and again, when the sexual revolution unfolded in the 1960s, and I know I'm a little bit older than you, so I lived through that a little bit more than many of our listeners, you still didn't see it coming. I mean, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had an uncle that was a homosexual, lived with a homosexual partner, then later they moved to Arizona. In some respects, I saw parts of that coming, but I don't even think some people in the so-called gay rights movement, which again is almost becoming an anachronism now, saw that this would be such a big issue, nor do I think people like Martina Navratilova would think that they would be vilified for saying the obvious, and that is when you allow boys who call themselves girls competing in girls' sports, women's sports, you've completely destroyed what last category existed for female athletes. And so in some respects, as you said, it happened fairly quickly, but it's been devastating even for those individuals who up until now were probably somewhat in favor of the sexual revolution and even the idea of gender identity, but they didn't necessarily see it coming this fast and creating such turmoil within our society.
Well, you're absolutely right. But, they were holding the gas can in the beginning of this, the gas can and a box of matches, and they lit it. This reminds me of the parable of the universal acid that the evolutionist Daniel Dennett tells.
Right.
And he's right when he says that evolution's like universal acid. It burns through every part of knowledge and theory and civilization. Well, the same thing's true here. It's like the sexual revolution is an acid. It eventually burns through everything. And that universal acid meant that it would eventually corrode everything. And so those who up front said, all we want is the normalization of, say, gay male behavior. And then the others said, no, you got to add to that the lesbian movement. No, you got to add to that bisexuals. No, you have to add to that, transgender. And now you have to add to that those who are non-binary. And then you're going to have to add to that polygamous. Those who set the fire in the beginning are, whether they want to be seen as such or not, they're responsible for this.
I would think so. One of the other chapters is on the generational storm, and I've noticed that we do kind of a millennial roundtable, and one that lately we've even talked about Generation Z or the iGen generation. And up until now, a lot of, especially in the more secular millennials, have said, who am I to say that two individuals, if we want to get married, if they're the same gender, well, that seems like justice. And then all of a sudden, when they saw that some of the so-called gay activists were actually sort of bullies, there's been kind of a U-turn a little bit, whereas before they were sort of for the gay agenda, for the homosexual agenda, for the idea of allowing people to express their viewpoints. But then when they started seeing them acting like bullies and telling individuals that were baking cakes or doing photography that they had to actually submit or pay the price for it, and actually develop a cancel culture in that regard, that is certainly the case. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about this gathering generational storm. And in particular, Christian Smith, we've talked about him before, came up with this kind of acronym of moralistic therapeutic deism. And what does that mean in terms of a generation that maybe isn't looking at things biblically? And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about religious liberty. But I think you're going to find this book very helpful wonderful because it looks at all sorts of different aspects of our society and helps us understand that there's a gathering storm in a number of fronts, and that's the reason why we need to be faithful Christians, speaking truth into the culture. So when we come back, we'll get into the idea of generation and religious liberty. And again, I think if you would like some more information, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. We have a link to albertmohler.com, and we have information about the book, The Gathering Storm. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we're privileged to have with us Dr. Albert Mohler as we talk about his book, The Gathering Storm. It's published by Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get a copy if you don't have access to that. Secularism, Culture, and the Church. We also have a link to almohler.com, and you can find some material there. Dr. Mohler, for just a few minutes, let's, if we can, talk about the generational storm, the rise of moralistic therapeutic deism. That comes from our friend Dr. Christian Smith. But he really helps us understand that in some respects, the younger generation does not perceive the Bible or the self or the culture in the same way maybe that you and I do.
That's so true. And, you know, the group he was actually writing about are now adults.
Yes.
And the generation coming behind them, or if anything, even more, committed or shaped by that moralistic therapeutic deism. Those three words, he just used it with his team to say that whatever religion they think they have, it basically just comes down to the fact that God there is a God. He wants you to be basically good, the moralistic. He wants you to be basically happy. That's the therapeutic. And yet he's not involved in everyday life, so you don't need to think about him much. That's the deism. And and by the way, the most indicting section of what he wrote was the fact that he said, where did they get it? He said they got it from their churches. And that's what's so sad. Churches that don't preach the Bible, churches that don't teach biblical truth, churches that do not declare the whole counsel of God, produce little moralistic therapeutic deists. They may think themselves Christians, but in the end, they're just very thin in terms of their beliefs, their doctrines, their theology. And it's going to take a lot of theology for young people to stay Christian. It's going to take a lot of doctrine. It's going to take a lot of truth. It's going to take a lot of Bible. And so I just want to say that to parents, Christian parents. It's going to take your children, teenagers, young people, knowing a lot of the Bible and believing the Bible if they're going to stay Christian. They need a lot of theology. They need a lot of doctrine, and they need a lot of modeling faithful biblical Christianity seen before their eyes.
They're going to need to know a little bit more about the Bible than they do about Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, or whatever it might be lately. And again, you have a whole section there on Silicon Valley and social capital and some of that, which is on the engines of culture. But I wanted to leave enough time just to talk about the issue of religious liberty, because you and Kelly Shackelford, who, by the way, says hello to you and will be here with us tomorrow, really has been on the front lines of this issue of religious liberty. But I was really encouraged to see that in addition to a lawyer who's been fighting this battle of religious liberty, you are willing to join with him in an op-ed, because as a pastor and a president of a seminary and an individual that's kind of seen as more of a theologian, you still understand that this issue of religious liberty is something that we as Christians need to be involved with, and not just turn it over to the lawyers, because if indeed we lose our religious liberty, your seminary might not exist. The pulpits that we are depending upon to teach God's word might not exist. So talk about that, if you might.
Well, a secular society is going to collide with any kind of serious theism, and in particular, biblical Christianity. And a society is coercive. That every society is, and its coercive power is going to be used against Christians trying to live Christianly. And if that sounds paranoid, just think about what's happening when you mention the cake bakers and the florists and the photographers being told they have to get out of that business if they won't make a positive declaration that they support same-sex marriage. Similarly, I mean, you've got the professions and the guilds. How long is it going to be before the NCAA or the American Bar Association say you've got to have this position on sexuality? You can't be a lawyer. You can't play intercollegiate athletics. Make no mistake, we're very close to that. And then think about the COVID-19 context and how many governors, for instance, have put in place the most unconstitutional policies because they say, hey, basically we can tell churches what to do. Now, again, Kelly Shackelford and I have argued in public that churches ought to respect, out of love of God and love of neighbor, generally applicable, temporary, reasonable restrictions. Yes, we want to be good neighbors. We want to love our neighbor. But some of these governors and other government leaders have gone far beyond that.
Let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, talk about some of the things on your website. First of all, there's a great link to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and also there's a link to Boyce College, as well as, of course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the briefing, because you're putting out material every single day. And so, first of all, let's talk about how people can maybe use this book, number one, and then number two, how in some respects additional material can be found on your website. So how does that all come together?
I appreciate that, Kerby. Yes, this book and the other books I've written really come out of my life trying to deal with these issues. And The Gathering Storm is an argument, and it's in book form, and I certainly hope Christians find it to be very helpful. But I continue that argument every day, 5 days a week on the briefing, which is an opportunity for me to look at the major issues before us in the society and try to think about how, operating from a Christian worldview, we should think about these things. I do, and that's called The Briefing, and it's found at my website, Albert Mohler, that's Mohler.com. I do another podcast called Thinking in Public, another program that I have conversations with all kinds of thoughtful people, some of them non-Christians, because I want to show Christians how to have a conversation with non-Christians. about the big ideas. We live in a contest of ideas. We shouldn't be embarrassed or reluctant to jump into that contest of ideas. And then a host of articles. I think it's something like 7 million words on my website. That's a lot of words, but hopefully Christians will find help there.
People sometimes say, Kerby, I don't know how you do it all. And I go, no, I don't know how Dr. Albert Mohler does it all, but nevertheless, fascinating. And again, we have a link, first of all, to albertmohler.com. And so then you can click on the button that says articles, and then there's one on the briefing, and then one thinking in public. Upper right-hand corner, you can click on the opportunity to find out more about Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I might just mention real quickly, as since you are the president of that seminary, we've all recognized how in some respects it is good for people to go to Louisville, Kentucky and study there. But because you have online courses, some of our listeners can actually study in that regard as well, can't they?
That's right. We all of our major academic programs, from the baccalaureate up to the doctorates, are available online. I appreciate you pointing that out. So even in the context of a pandemic, we're fully in business and hopefully helping the church faithfully.
Well, I appreciate your faithfulness in writing so much that you do, and I really thank you for this book, which has just come out this week, and so I wanted everybody to know about it. If you go to the bookstore today, it's so new that it might not have arrived, but if it has, I would encourage you to pick up a copy, and if you would like to find a better way to order it, we've also provided that on the website. Of course, we have a link to albertmohler.com, and you can use all of that material. And Dr. Mohler, I think that in addition to this being good for individual study, the way you've broken it down, I think you could actually use this in a small group study or a Bible fellowship too, couldn't you?
Well, thank you. Some churches are doing that, and some groups of Christians. So that's very encouraging, and I'm thrilled to death they would use it that way.
Well, again, it is always a delight to have you on the program. I appreciate the good work that you've done, and I really look forward to the next opportunity when we talk about another one of your books or maybe something on the briefing. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, I'm always glad to be with you, Kerby, and I'm always thankful for you, your ministry, and Point of View. Such an important voice, so keep it going.
Let's, if we can, take a break. And when we do so, we will then, of course, have our Friday weekend edition tomorrow. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford will be with us. I've actually postponed some really good and important topics to address, and hopefully we'll be able to fit some of those in tomorrow. But the theme here is the storm is coming. And so what are we going to do about it? Well, we need to stand in the midst of the storm. We need to learn what we can to make a difference. And Dr. Albert Mohler provides some great material in his book, The Gathering Storm, Secularism, Culture, and the Church. It is all available, and information about it is available at the website pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a good day. We will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.